Hello and welcome to another session of Groundbreakers Live. I'm your host, Javed Mohammed, and I'm very honored to have with us David Ayers. David, welcome.
Hello.
And David is the VP of Engineering at Innovation Homes. And the reason we are talking today is because David is going to be speaking at dev.next with a title called Communicating and Documenting Architectural Decisions, Design and Architecture. Quite a mouthful. But I think the key words there are communicating and decisions. So let's touch upon that. How did you come up, first of all, with the idea of doing this presentation?
So I think that in my experience, how we go about making decisions and documenting those decisions, and then how we communicate those to larger audiences are struggles that sort of resonate with a lot of different people, kind of regardless of the size of your organization, regardless of the complexity. We all make decisions and have to deal with the ramifications of those decisions, and we all have to figure out ways to make sure people know that we've made decisions. So I think it's been, it's kind of the struggle of a lot of engineering organization. Well, any engineering organization has these struggles. So I've over the course of my career tried several things and just thought it would be interesting to share some things that had worked for me more as recipes for how these kinds of problems could be solved. And I think taking those recipes and applying them to your particular environment is going to be different for everyone. But I think there's still some ideas that are common that have worked well for me.
Okay, so I won't make you go through your whole presentation, but could you give, perhaps just for the purpose of this conversation, we could come up with a use case. So as some kind of a scenario, you want to just kind of set that up, and then perhaps we could walk through something like that.
Yeah, sure. So the talk really kind of talks about several techniques to manage and record architectural decisions. So I'll talk about one of them really quick, which is architectural decision records. So this is not something I invented. It's a thing in the world. There's lots of documentation out there about this concept. But the idea is, let's say you have a decision to make about how you're going to approach solving a problem from an architecture standpoint. That might be a very local problem to a team, like, hey, we're going to build a thing. What front-end framework should we use? Should we use React or Vue? So that's a very kind of local example of a decision that you're going to make. And then you get higher up to decisions that you're going to maybe make as a technology organization, like how are we going to approach version control? What are we going to use, get versus a version? That's a silly argument because probably no one uses a version anymore or would choose that. But there was a time when that choice was a real thing, when Git was sort of first emerging. So it's a decision that impacts a broad variety of stakeholders across the entire technology organization. So maybe we can use those two examples as a lens to discuss this more.
Okay. So once you come to something like that, so what are some of the criteria you need to look at? So how do you make good decisions? And that probably goes well beyond just making architectural decisions, because I think like probably in every day of our lives, we make a lot of decisions, everything from, what are you going to put on to probably more important decisions.
Yeah, and so for me, the talk doesn't necessarily focus on how you go about making decisions. It's more about what you do after a decision is made. But like most people are really good, about making decisions, right? Like I would say in general, technology teams. That's why we're in the business we're in, is because we do a good job at kind of understanding the landscape and figuring out the best fit for a team in terms of skill sets and making a decision that works for the team. What I think we're not good at is, like I'll take that example of a team starting building something new and deciding on a front end framework. So they choose React or Vue. That's something you would imagine that they might approach by doing some spikes. They try out maybe building a few pages in Vue and building a few pages in React and looking at the results and comparing how that works. And then looking at the skill set of the team and what is their level of ability to work with technologies like this, and is there one that fits better to the particular team makeup than another technology? So you have all these great discussions and lots of probably whiteboard sessions and meetings and spikes, and then you make a decision, right? And you're cool. Let's use React, and you start building a thing. What generally speaking is lost, and what I try to capture with the talk, is the context behind all those decisions, right? Because what we're not good at doing as engineers and software developers is being nice to our future selves, right? We hate our future selves, right? They you know, we so 6 months from now, you have someone new join the team, and they're like, "Hey, why didn't you guys use Vue instead of React?" And we're like, I mean, no one, like all those decisions and all of that context, generally speaking, is lost. So that's kind of the idea behind these architectural decision records. They don't replace decision-making processes. They just give you a moment of pause after a decision is made to write down some of those things. So what are the when you choose one thing over another, there are always consequences, right? Those could be positive consequences or negative consequences. You probably thought about those things when you were making the decision. Just take a minute and write them down. So that's kind of the idea behind architectural decision records, or ADRs, is take a moment to record what the decision is, what its consequences are, and some of the context around the decision. Why did you choose React? Well, we chose React because we had 3 people on the team that had used it previously and no one on the team that had used Vue. So that was a part of the context that led us toward that decision.
Can I just pause you there? Because I think what you're saying, I mean, everything you're saying is very important. I get the part about being able to, first of all, just documenting it, writing down what the decision was, why you made it. I think that the part that you touch upon about talking about is impact in the future. That's a very hard thing to predict, isn't it?
It is. I mean, and so it's, some of this is to the best of your ability. I mean, the ADR process is designed to be lightweight, right? So it's not designed to be like an impact study where you spend weeks thinking about all of the possible ramifications. It's really about, we had a discussion, we made a decision. As part of that discussion, we probably talked about the things that, well, if we choose React, it means X, Y, and Z. Just write X, Y, and Z down so that you know what that means. It's not, it doesn't try to be an exhaustive research paper on every possible outcome as a result of the decision. It's really about, like, again, I think most people, these are things you talk about. It's just take the things that you talk about and wrote them down so that future members of the team can benefit from that, and that your future self can benefit from that.
Okay. So that's probably kind of a natural segue. So you talked about the decision-making part of it and documenting it. So in terms of communication, you said about writing it down. Are there any good best practices in terms of how you kind of capture, that context?
Yeah. Like, the answer is it's complex. I can tell you some of the techniques that we use. So one of the things I like about ADRs is, if you talk about it at the team level, they're an artifact for the team, right? So someone building something and choosing React versus Vue as their front end framework, that's a team level decision. So the idea with ADRs is that they actually live as a document inside the code base. So there's as part of your code base in Git or wherever it is that you host code, there's a folder called ADR, and in that folder are markdown documents describing all of the decisions that were made. So I found that to be very effective versus putting it like in a wiki or putting it in a SharePoint site, right? Those are things that, generally speaking, developers don't love anyway. But putting it closer to the code, to me, gives it a stronger ability to be heard in terms of communication, right? So from a team level, and as you start building these processes and things into teams, the team is now aware that this is a thing. And if they want to propose a new decision, you use the same workflow that you use for code, right? Like today, you make changes to the code and you put them in a pull request. If you want to propose a new thing, you can propose that in a pull request, and it just follows the same workflow. So to me, it removes some of the friction from communicating these decisions that maybe exist by putting them in other places like wikis or Word docs or whatever. If you talk about the higher level decisions that are being made across an organization. So for example, we created a repo called like technical architecture. And that was a repo that everyone in the organization had access to. And the same thing, if we wanted to propose, we would like to use Git as our version control system versus version. That would be something that would be a pull request to that repository made widely available. So that's one way we communicated them. Another thing I talk about in the talk is we had an architecture guild, which sort of was the body that was given responsibility for the creation and management of those technical architecture ADR and owning that repository. So you kind of have this group of built-in evangelists, right? And these are people from all different teams across the company that participate in this process of creating ADRs, and then they become evangelists to go back to their team to spread decisions. So that's another way we do it. And then we also published a newsletter, like an email newsletter that went out and said, hey, for everyone on the team, here are all of the decisions that have been made recently related to technical architecture and some color commentary around the discussions that went into them. So, you know, like anything, I don't think there's one right answer for how you communicate something. In fact, I think any good communication strategy has to include more than one way of communicating, right? Because some people are visual learners, some people like to read, and by no means are those the only ways you can communicate them. Those are just, we found a combination of those things to be effective in making sure that most people understood the kinds of decisions that were made and what the decisions were.
Okay. Well, it sounds like a fascinating presentation, and definitely encourage the viewers out there to check it out. So David, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.